So the emphasis of what I'm trying to do here is to create a record of the process of writing poetry, to sort of demystify all of the things that are associated with it. It's possible, it's doable, but this is the way that I do it. I'm by no means an expert, but I will be explaining the methods that I go about in creating these poems, and hopefully they'll be enlightening. So with this poem, I like to use a moleskin notebook just as a way of collecting ideas, of getting things down on paper. Typically I like to ask a lot of questions and often begin with a simple idea or a thought to see where that takes me. In this case, because of the work that I'm doing in my collection, I was working on ideas from childhood, mining different memories and important values that I derived from them. One of those was for Adventures in Odyssey. This was a radio program that I listened to all throughout my childhood, but it essentially created a town with one very special place, an ice cream parlor whose owner was also an inventor, created something like an imagination station, which I reference later on. But you could essentially go back to these Bible stories and then partake in them. It was only later that I realized that it was really pretty traumatizing. But in any case, the way that I went about trying to draft this poem was on the left-hand side of the page, talking about different thoughts or ideas that came to mind, like the stories that stood out to me, like the dribble of Lot's wife into salt, or Jael driving a stake through a king's head. And then on the right-hand side of the page, I started explaining these different instances. And I found that as I went on, I found more and more times that these Bible stories that I was working with also had some bearing on my personal experiences. And this poem became more interesting the more that I looked at my relationship to these characters as opposed to the characters themselves. So I begin the poem by moving it over to a Word document as a way of drafting it and perhaps revising and writing it. And I wanted to begin the poem with a stark first line. Typically that's what's powerful, what's captivating, not unlike a hook in an essay. So I figured on some unique language with Jael pithering, shunting a tent stake through the king's head. Pithering, I later found out I meant to say dithering, but it sounded nice in my head. But essentially I create these three instances, very famous Bible stories that were also well done in the radio program, and then I created a poem based around that. Now, on the right-hand side of the page, you see my first draft, and there are a lot of unique statements in there, but it also runs pretty dry. I've got I am listed a couple of different times, but I realized that that wasn't the heart of the poem. In fact, I made changes to frame the poem and to create little postmarks for the reader to attach to with some nights, and some nights instead of I am statements. I also moved the sequence of three images at the beginning. I shuffled them around so that the starkest of them, Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt, was at the end, leading into the shift in the dramatic situation. Otherwise, I was happy with the way that the language was produced in this, be it from a dim light bedroom or an all-American hometown, to create this sort of aura of memory and disappointment with reality. So one of the funny things that I always attached myself to in Adventures in Odyssey was that the main character, the voice actor, dies. And so on discovering that he in fact did die, I was pretty pained, to say the least, but it started to break this little bubble. So when the audio dramas had become an escape for me, that was a slap in the face. And so I decided to use that at the end of the poem as a way of establishing fragility and giving gravity to this coming to reality that these stories, these attached ideas, can't give weight to. So this is the poem Adventures in Odyssey. Some nights I am Jael, shunting a tent stake through the king's head, or 3 brave young men unburning in a furnace hotter than hell, or Lot's wife looking back and dribbling into pillars of salt. Some nights I am listening in the dim light bedroom as Mr. Whitaker, the voice of wisdom in the audio dramas, lifts me from the imagination station into Odyssey, the all-American hometown the radio makes me believe in. To me, he is 32 feet tall. When he goes missing for 3 seasons, his replacement voice actor is a 2-bit sham. I am too smart for that, so I discover his death in Colorado Springs, only he has a different name and face than the one I knew him by. And some nights, after longing for a home, I pull out the atlas and dig for a town I know doesn't exist.